our next presenter is Alex Coello de la Rosa. And so he is a senior professor of Asian and Latin American studies at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. He's the co-editor of the journal Islands and Empires. He does work on Jesuit history, the colonial history of the Philippines, and Peru. And he is currently the coordinator for the Master in Asian Pacific Studies in a global context at his university in Barcelona. And so Sidus Masi, Alex, for joining us, and I'm looking forward to your presentation, which is titled The Jesuit Presence in the Mariana Islands, 1668 to 1769, a 20th Century Historiographic Overview. Sidus Masi Tatlo.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation. I don't know how, okay, here it is. Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that I also changed a little bit my presentation, the title, which is, as you see, Conflict, Jesuit Evangelization and Local Agency in the Mariana Islands, because of time limit, basically. Well, this is part of an article that will appear soon in the Pacific Asian Inquirer. So basically what I would like to do is a very short historiographic overview of recent scholarship on the history of Jesuit evangelization of the Mariana Islands from the 16th century to 18th century. And basically, I'm very interested in showing part of the scholarship that has been influential in the last years, particularly on this issue. Well, let me see if I can move the presentation. Okay, thank you very much. I would start by saying that a few years ago, the Pacific world emerged as a field of study with its great diversity and territorial dispersion, which allowed us to transcend the national, longitudinal, theological structures and write a kind of horizontal, transnational, that is comparative and trans-imperial history about some of the most dynamic regions of this so-called Hispaniarum Rex. However, as Matt Matsuda and David Armitage, as you can see, among others, pointed out, what should be included and what should be left out from this geocultural category, which should be the limits of such an archipelagic that is constructed Pacific world. Following the work of William Alkire and Robert Keist and McMarshall, which argued that the pure CHamoru had disappeared due to their destruction, extinction, and mixing with our groups, mostly from the Philippines to Spain and Iberian Peninsula, anthropologists such as Nicholas Thomas and J. Dobbin still refuse to regard the CHamoru as native people. Let me just put the next one. Thank you. And yet, already in 1984, anthropologists such as Vince Diaz had argued that CHamoru identity could not be expected to remain static and immobile, and that it should be analyzed as partaking of a process of indigenous agency and situational flexibility. The next one, please. Such interaction were indeed central in the construction of CHamoru cultural adaptation, which is reflected in the present neo-CHamoru culture of Guam. Historians and anthropologists such as Francis Hezel, David Alay, Ulrich Strasser, and myself, or Fernando Ciaramitaro, have written on the material phenomenon in the Micronesian archipelagos. The next, please. Ciaramitaro, for his part, analyzed the Jesuit martyrdoms from the imperial Catholic perspective, that is, as titles of legitimation. The Catholic monarchy's devotional vocation was vindicated through a hagiographic and iconographic repertoire that glorified the Spanish conquest of the Mariana Archipelago and the foundation of the later missionary state. The monarchical material exaltation of Queen Mariana of Austria, engraved by Joseph Mulder in the work written by Father Gabriel de Aranda in the Vida y Gloriosa Muerte, the Padre Sebastián de Monroy, does not constitute an exception, but the norm for the penetration of the Catholic and civilizing message into the Western Indies and the Philippines. In 2015, Francis Hezel published a text that complements his first monograph, From Conversion to Conquest, under the name When Cultures Clash, Revisiting the Spanish Chamorro Wars, and which practically restates his initial conclusion that the scourge of imported diseases was the main cause for the dramatic population decline of the Chamorro. Thus, while Hezel continued to regard the intermittent outbreaks of violence known as the Spanish Chamorro Wars as of secondary importance, other scholars have gone so far as to describe these armed clashes as genuine civil wars. In this regard, other scholars, such as Stephanie Mawson, has paid attention to emerging hostilities, particularly those related to military participation. The mutinies of the soldiers stationed in the Wuhan Presidio and the demographic decline that prompted the resettlement of the remaining Chamorro inhabitants of the 8 northern Mariana Islands into various parishes reductions in 1699. Other studies such as, for instance, those of David Atienza and myself, Atienza and Hezel himself, argue that Chamorro culture survives the ravages of colonialism, playing an active role in the historical development of their islands and in the history of the Pacific. The next slide, please. The book written, for instance, by Horacio de la Costa, the Jesuits in the Philippines, is still the most comprehensive study on the activities of the Society of Jesus in the Philippines. However, as we know, it contained very few references to the Jesuits in the Marianas, presumably because they were not considered part of the Philippine archipelago, even if they were under its jurisdiction. Certainly, by analyzing the interaction between the universal principles of Catholicism, other scholars have placed the Marianas into the framework of the global microhistory of Christianity. David Atienza and James Perez Viernes have critically assessed the way in which local political actors and actions conditioned the missionaries' work. They reject the reductionist thesis of Hans Hornsbostel, Ian Campbell, Don Farrell, and Robert Rogers that present the native Chamorro as a Hispanized people, that is, as fervent Catholics and or peonized peasants. Next slide, please. Others, such as Pedro Cardim, Tamar Herzog, Jose Javier Ruiz Ibáñez, and Gaetano Sabatini, challenge the center-periphery model that regards indigenous peoples as passive and silent recipients of Western innovation instead of active participants in the elaboration of politics at a greater scale. Instead of assuming that the Marianas were isolated and distant, the new missional history, among which I myself include, emphasized cosmopolitanism and circulation of ideas as indicators of the relationships established between European, American, Asian, and Oceanic peoples. Resistance and or accommodation vis-a-vis the colonial conflict and actors were significant. By focusing on this local dimension, other historians have emphasized a process of missional globalization through which the Chamorro entered the international community as members of the Spanish Empire and the global communion of the Roman Catholic Church. As regards to early colonial history of the Marianas, gender issues were often neglected. Enrique Moral from the UPF in Barcelona suggests that the Chamorro communities openly opposed the Jesuits' evangelizing project because they tried to impose gendered practices and discourses through the transformation of native space and architectural structures. These ethnosexual conflicts, understood as the clash between incompatible beliefs and practices related to sexuality, are articulated around constructed spaces or materialities considered sinful, that is, the public bachelor's house. Similarly, archaeologist Sandra Monton has explored the early years of the far-flung Jesuit missions in Wuhan to describe how their global policy of evangelization was not only about the expansion, conquest, and colonization initiated by Spain, but also a desire to globally propagate a certain ideology and policy around sexuality. The next one, please. And the other one. Thank you. There's no doubt that Jesuit missionaries imposed a patriarchal system within the indigenous society in an attempt to dismantle the native ways of life in the Marianas. In this way, Strasser's last book raises interesting questions. Drawing heavily from gender studies, she wonders how a remote archipelago in the margins of the Spanish overseas empire turned into a magnet of desire for Spanish and foreign Jesuits, particularly Germans, in the late 17th century. The novelty of her book is the way she links gender history to world or global history in the early modern period. Jesuit missions and missionaries were coded as masculine on Iberian domains where men were seemingly the only actors on stage. However, while patriarchal dynamics marked Jesuit history from the very beginning, missionaries were shaped by gender in different yet allegedly contradictory ways. Emotions, or more accurately, passions, are part and parcel of this study of Jesuit masculinities. Missionary men inspired other novices to imitatio, their illustrious forefathers, as well as those Jesuit exemplars who died as martyrs of the Catholic faith on the distant missions. As Strasser points out, mimesis of Francis Xavier played itself out in the lives of two Jesuits, the Spanish father, Diego Luis de San Vítores, and the Bohemian father, Augustin Strobach, who sought to emulate the apostle of the Indies in the Marianas, long after his death and colonization. She argues that they were virtual copies of Francis Xavier with a twist. While the original Xavier longed for martyrdom in vain, San Vítores and Strobach were able to shed blood for their faith. It was in the very act of preaching the gospel to those distant souls that lived in a group of islands in the immensity of the Pacific that the Jesuit missionaries, according to Strasser, developed a preoccupation for less distant souls, their own. Male mimesis facilitated the society's extraordinary expansion across the early modern world, allowing for new forms of action by working the human passions. These powerful spiritual motives, already pinpointed by Pierre Cheney, stand in opposition to those considered by scholars such as Cynthia Ross Waco, who recently referred to the Jesuits as mere agents of the imperial conquest of Wuhan after 1668. Some other historians have underlined the difficulties and adaptations that went with the construction of imperial hegemonies in intercultural contexts. The work of Augusto de Viana, in particular, argued with compelling evidence that the Spanish colonial empire could not have constructed without the effective collaboration and participation of the Philippines' native peoples, the Tagalogs, Visayans, and especially the Pampanga soldiers of Macabebe. The next slide. Thank you. The same goes for some Chamorros, including chiefs Don Andrés de la Cruz, Don Ignacio de Ineti, and Don Antonio de Ayiji, who collaborated with the Jesuits in the mission's consolidation. These essential allies not only served and assisted the Spanish administration, but also acted as effective soldiers and officers of the mission. The Spanish would not have able to defeat Chamorro resistance without native Chamorro soldiers who joined the mission's armed contingent, which for its part had more soldiers of Philippine than of European origin. Native soldiers were more readily adapted to the terrain and served as valuable interpreters and mediators, both necessary elements that proved vital for the conquest and colonization of the islands. The experiences and history of the soldiers themselves have also been addressed in the new historiography, with Stephanie Mawson specifically looking at the mutinies carried out by the soldiers stationed at the Wuhan Presidio in XVII, and their loyalty and commitment to the construction of the Spanish Empire in the Pacific. In line with arguments developed by Michael de Bacqua, anthropologist David Atienza rejects the premise that the pure Chamorro of the pre-Hispanic period ceases to exist, and he questions the notion that the Spanish genocide orchestrated through the so-called Spanish Chamorro Wars practically eliminated the native population, and that the new Chamorro people was formed by the mix of the few remaining natives and settlers from Spanish America, Tagalogs and Pampangans from the Philippines. Atienza argues that both Francis Hezel's thesis of the fatal impact of the West upon a defenseless island society, as well as Enrique Moral's thesis of biopolitics as a system of population control, eclipse the capacity of the Chamorro to act as agents in their own history, especially regarding their appropriation of the Jesuits' evangelical message and the production and reproduction of an entirely Chamorro cultural experience. In several other works, Ulrich Strasser has argued that, like a new Francisco Xavier, Father San Vitores regarded the Marianas as a feminine space that invited the masculine project of planting the seed of Christ by becoming a martyrs of faith. Other historians, such as James Tweller, argued that new social networks of conversion were gradually creating and solidifying between the newcomers and the Chamorro, paving the way for the Christianization of the native population. As conversion to Christianity occurred in the surrounding social world, the religious changes of the early modern Chamorro should be best understood in the context of the social networks among all the inhabitants of the Mariana Islands. The Chamorro were also more than mere victims of evil colonizers led by priests who were obsessed with turning them into obedient and pious subjects of the Spanish crown. In his 2016 article, Chamorro scholar Pérez Viernes staunchly defended Magalahi Urao's famous speech, which was delivered during the first Chamorro rebellion in 1671, as an example of indigenous resistance and agency. Indeed, this was neither historical speculation nor myth, because it really took place. It is worth remembering that the Chamorro were not the only native group that proved gifted in oratory. In the Paraguayan Reducciones and southern Chilean missions, Jesuits also considered Guaranis and Mapuches huiliches, respectively, as fine and eloquent orators. In contrast to the interpretation of those European scholars who defend the rhetoric, that is, Jesuit character of Urao's speech, Pérez Viernes argues that their dismissal of native agency obscures Urao's actual leadership. But this scholarship does not deny Urao's, Hulas, Agualin's capacity to mobilize their fellow islanders in the thousands to confront the Spaniards. It does, however, emphasize Urao's speech as Jesuit propaganda to justify Western conquest and evangelization. Chamorro historiography has acknowledged that the indigenous historical experience and native agency transcend what has been represented in Eurocentric histories and apologetic interpretations of the colonial past. In so doing, Pérez Viernes' 2016 article laid the foundations of the native heroes of the Marianas. When delivering his speech, Urao transmuted into a national archetype, not only inspired the masses, Pérez contends, but also contributed to the making of his people's history. As he often reminds us, Urao will be a source of inspiration for the future generations, thereby turning him into an icon of Chamorro identity. One thing is certain: the words he uttered are lost in translation, so that it is impossible to know what he once said. Nonetheless, it is evident that what Jesuit missionaries recorded in Wuhan had nothing to do with Urao's own wording, because that way of uttering was instead a beautifully crafted exercise of Jesuit rhetoric. The next one, please. The Jesuits in Wuhan also discovered the Chamorro's ritualized forms of artistic expression, such as music and dance. In a recent text, David Irving analyzes music as a mediating element through which the missionaries try to transform the hearts of the Chamorro people. Thank you. Festivities and civic religious celebrations combine elements from the indigenous Chamorro culture, theatrical performances, poetry, and singing in the Chamorro language, with Spanish plays and Mexican dances. The introduction of new styles, dances, and musical instruments brought over from Europe, Mexico, and the Philippines was used as an evangelization strategy that had a significant impact on Chamorro musical culture. On the other hand, the incorporation of local musicians in liturgy and post-mortem rituals, which was recorded by 19th century travelers such as Jacques Arago and Louis de Freycinet, evidence how Waham became a unique microcosmos of cultural exchange, bringing Spanish, Mexican, and African elements into dialogue with Micronesian musical culture. To conclude, the methodologically creative dissertation by Verónica Peña Filiu, Alimentación y Colonialismo en las Islas, defended in the University Pompeu Fabra in 2020, combines written and archaeological sources to analyze the changes and continuities that were produced in the diet of the Marianas inhabitants during the Jesuit period. Historians Rebecca Earle, Trudy Eden, and Heather Martel had already argued about the centrality of food in the first European colonial expansion. The process of evangelizing and occupying the archipelago entailed the introduction of cattle raising and new methods of agriculture, carried out in small ranches known as lanchos or lanchus to produce new foodstuffs, wheat, grapes, legumes, beef, pork. Changes in dietary and culinary practices were multidirectional, however, with local Iberian and American foods comprising the fare of the archipelago's inhabitants. Well, this presentation, as a concluding remark, has offered a historiographical, very short, and I'm afraid quick, historiographical overview on the first modern Catholic missions established in the Mariana Islands. From the pioneer text of Marjorie Driver and Franz Hezel, historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists have studied the Jesuit missions not as a complement of Western imperialism, but as a privileged field for to understand intercultural encounters. In a system of territorial frontier occupation, recent studies have emphasized aspects related with the martyrial phenomenon, confessionalization, military uprisings, and cultural transformations in the post-cultural contact period. Standing against the essentialist thesis that questioned the native character of today's Chamorro, several scholars challenge the supposed disappearance of these native people and argue instead for their cultural continuity. Not surprisingly, Carolina Fernandez, next slide please, argues that the islanders' religious practices are similarly a blend of cultures. They are intensely marked by the Catholicism brought by the Jesuits in the 17th century, but not fully detached from Chamorro spirituality. Well, thank you very much for attending. It's been a pleasure. I'm very glad to deliver this short presentation from Seville, where I'm here now conducting a research. And I hope to see you soon in the Marianas. Thank you very much.
Sidus Masi, Alex. And I should note that if you don't have a copy of, for those of you listening, if you don't have a copy of the new edition of History of the Mariana Islands, you definitely should get one. I've bought a few copies to give to friends for Christmas last year, and for those that read it, it really expanded their understanding of the time of the Chamorro-Spanish Wars and the time of first contact between Chamorros and Spanish. And so Sidus Masi for publishing that through UOG Press.